Andrew. Good morning, everybody. We have really assembled a fantastic group of analysts here this morning, and I hope you find them as insightful as we have. As journalists, there are certain people we just turn to again and again and again for analysis, for direction, for guidance as to what's happening in the world. We wanted to make sure we got into the geopolitics in this session, so we've assembled 4 of the smartest interpreters of what's going on between the AI superpowers that we could think of. And I'm really grateful to all of them for agreeing to join us in their far-flung locations this morning. So let's see if we can put them up on the screen. I'm hoping that this works remotely. We've got a kind of a Brady Bunch format here. Good morning, everybody. Good evening to you, those of you who are in different time zones. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us here in Singapore. It's an interesting week to be talking about the US-China AI superpower rivalry. A lot of things happening. One of the things that's going on that's quite interesting is that just after we close today, many people will be convening in Shanghai for the World AI Congress there. This is an event that has been going on for several years, and it's getting bigger and bigger every year. Last year at the World Economic Congress, when it was over, Fortune ran a commentary by a Chinese analyst based in the US that was a little bit dismissive of the Chinese internet and of the Chinese AI capabilities and the platforms that China was developing. And said, they're fine on apps, but they're not really doing anything that's fundamentally revolutionary. And I think that sentiment prevailed all the way through. I mean, I certainly heard a lot of that at Davos earlier this year. And then there was this amazing announcement about breakthrough at DeepSeek, this company that no one had heard of. So Paul, Ray, you're going to the World Economic Congress in just a matter of days here. Love to get your insights on what you expect to find there. And do we really think that China is still a laggard in the AI space? We heard yesterday from Stanford, gave an AI index presentation that showed these kind of 2 curves of China and the US, their capabilities converging very rapidly. And Russell Ward told us that at the current rate of change, that by this time next year, China would probably be in the lead rather than playing catch up. Ray, let's start with you. What do you think about that? And what do you expect to see in Shanghai?
Hi, first of all, thanks for having me on this panel. Yeah, really excited to go to the conference. I think that you're absolutely right. Before DeepSeek, there was this shared impression on both sides of the ocean that for sure the US is quite far ahead actually in especially cutting edge research. I think that lead has been shaved down quite a bit with more researchers and more startups pouring into the space from China. I think that the difference that I'm expecting to see though is still less on the foundational model edge. I think the US still retains that. I think China has done a lot more in terms of industrial applications and consumer also consumer applications versus last year. But the main difference that I see is the push in embodied intelligence, so putting AI into hardware. That is relatively early though, but I would say that actually as we're putting together this trip, a lot of the organizers, partners that we work with said, why are you doing AI trip? Robotics is where it's at in China today. And so we'll be doing a robotics trip later this year.
So say a little bit more about that, because you're taking actually a whole group of people to Shanghai and kind of being their Sherpa this week. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're meeting with a variety of we're going to the conference and seeing getting some detailed demos from exhibitors, but we're also going to some large companies to hear what they're doing in AI, including some of the very large publicly listed companies, and then meeting with a bunch of startups. And it was really interesting just curating the trip. You have, of course, the foundational model companies, then you have agents, which are fairly new. You have people doing video. That's been an area of strength for Chinese startups. And then we didn't actually get to put in too many robotics companies this time, but that was one of the feedback that I got, that if I had mentioned robotics, that might have gotten even more interest from local startups.
And how many of this group are investors? Because, I mean, I'm just curious about that because, again, even just last year, the phrase that China tech is uninvestable was still going around. That was kind of the conventional wisdom. All the foreign VC money into China had dried right up. Is that shifting?
Yes, so we do a lot of investor trips actually. So on the public market side, I think that sentiment has definitely shifted. You see the surge in the Hong Kong stock market,
Sure.
where, yeah, I guess it is sort of a surge compared to years past. And on the private capital side, which is more relevant for this trip, it's still very much a learning exercise. I don't think people are actually actively investing, but the makeup of this current group is about 60% investors and the remainder founders, academics, advisors, etc.
Really interesting. Paul, let me come to you next. Paul is an old friend of Fortune, has been coming to China many years. We've learned a lot from him. How do you see this rivalry shaping up? Is China no longer the laggard that we so recently thought that it was?
Great question, Clay, and thanks to be here. And I'm really excited to be on Raymond's trip here. We're looking forward to visiting companies here. I've been visiting a lot of Chinese companies over the past few months too, also on other trips to China. I think one thing that you raised a year ago, some of the comments, I think it's sort of mind-blowing that we can have a comment from Jensen Huang this week that says, China's open source AI is a catalyst for global progress, giving every country and industry a chance to join the AI revolution. So I think that's the way to look at this issue. It's a complicated issue when you talk about things like who's ahead and who's behind. I think the first sort of fundamental point here is that China and leading Chinese companies, with a few exceptions, have moved to open source, so-called open source and weight models. And in the case of DeepSeek, they're also releasing a lot of details about how those models were developed and some of the techniques they're using. And so we have things like, DeepSeek building on Mistral, a French AI open source company, and then Kimi and Moonshot building Kimi on the basis of some innovations that DeepSeek is using. So we have a very different world than we had a year ago. And over the last few months after the DeepSeek release, we have what I've called the DeepSeek effect rather than the DeepSeek moment, which is that in China now, open source models and uptake of models is sort of the thing, right? So we have Alibaba, Tencent, Moonshot, and other companies releasing really capable open source models, and then developers building on it. The second issue is the hardware issue, though, and that's a really complicated issue. And Riva has done some really good work on this. So despite U.S. export controls over the last year, Chinese companies have been able to continue to train models on their existing hardware base, for example, which is a mixture of older and very capable GPUs from companies like NVIDIA, and modified NVIDIA GPUs that were allowed for export to China for a period. And then also, a lot of them are developed in their own in-house AI-specific processors. And then finally, we're also seeing the uptake of some Huawei Ascend hardware, which is, again, is a complicated issue because of things like the software environment around the use of those GPUs that, model developers in China, 1.5 million, I think Jensen said, are familiar with NVIDIA's software stack. And so that's a big issue going forward in terms of, as we think ahead of, who's going to be able to continue to train models and what they're going to be training the models on. But in any case, there's no lack of hardware right now in China, advanced GPU hardware for companies to train models. And all the recent releases and the upcoming DeepSeek release of their R2 reasoning model and V4 base model are going to be really important. Because we're also in this game of moving away finally from just looking at benchmarks. There's still a lot of focus on benchmarks.
Right.
But in China, I think that the focus is really on sort of use cases, real world use cases. And so we're seeing the uptake of DeepSeek models and other open source models by companies for very specific kinds of use cases. And this is really important. And Raymond mentioned the agentic AI, and companies like Manus and others are, in China like Tencent, are really pushing on the agentic AI front. We're really just on the cusp of that part of the industry beginning to take off. And I think China will have an advantage there because, as we all know, Chinese are technology adopters and users, and companies are no different now. The signal from the top from Xi Jinping is, go forward with AI development. And so I think we're in a really different world play than we were a year ago when you last tackled this issue.
Fascinating. Helen, I wonder if you could pick up on Paul's point about open source. Obviously, you've been at OpenAI, which moved from being very enamored with open source to kind of being a much more proprietary kind of business model. But China has wholeheartedly embraced this open source idea. And in the US, I think there's this kind of growing consensus among the tech giants that that's not the way to go. But China sees that it's a way to actually spread its influence, I suspect. How should we be thinking about that? Because part of the metric for who's kind of, if you want to think of this as a superpower rivalry, who's ahead in gaining influence, is third countries and whose technology is getting picked up and adapted and used. And obviously, if you can pick up a DeepSeek or Manus platform and use it for free or for very, very cheap, it makes it a lot more compelling than paying a lot of money for OpenAI or for Gemini or whatever it is. Is open source the way forward, or is it kind of a dead end? How should we think about that?
The way I suggest thinking about it is I think two things are true at the same time, even though they might seem contradictory. One is one important dynamic that's going on with the open source decisions being made right now, or as Paul said, we should really talk about open weight models, because the model weights which let you run the model yourself are being made open, but a lot of other elements of these AI systems are not. But the way to think about it is, or one way to think about it is that if you're in the lead, so if you're at OpenAI, an Anthropic, a Google, if you're really leading, then you have this incredibly valuable asset that it actually sort of strategically is easy to understand why they wouldn't want to just hand that away for free to their competitors if they're really at that forefront, if they're able to sell access to their closed systems for at a premium. Whereas if you're in a following position, so if you are a DeepSeek or a Moonshot or an Alibaba, then it does make much more sense to make your models openly available, because you can't compete at the very, very frontier, at that sort of most cutting edge level. And instead, what you can do is you can show how advanced you are. You can create a DeepSeek moment potentially. You can also buy a lot of goodwill. So I think there is that sort of leader-follower dynamic, where from a strategic perspective, maybe it makes more sense to be releasing models openly as a follower. At the same time, I think sometimes American commentators will use that to say, and therefore don't need to make things openly available, no problem, because we're winning. At the same time, I do think that what we've seen over the last couple of years is how much soft power is available to people who are willing to, and organizations that are willing to make their technology available freely, because it does, both in terms of recruiting talent for your organization, it builds that goodwill, it builds that excitement about, oh, if I work there, I'll be able to release my work freely. But also among, of course, countless enterprises, governments, individual users around the world who get to take your model and play with it and tinker with it and fine-tune it and adapt it to your use case. And so I think that has been a little bit neglected in sort of the thinking where it's only about am I leading or following, is that soft power element as well. And I'm not sure, I might dispute your characterization that there is sort of consensus on the US side about moving away from open source. We have seen, for example, OpenAI announcing that they do want to release a really strong open source model. They have pushed that back. There's speculation about whether that's because they're dismayed about releases like one we saw from Moonshot a year or two ago, or exactly what the reasoning is. But I think, and Google does release their Gemma models, which are sort of smaller, less capable, but more usable versions of their closed models. So I think it's still, I think the open source battle is still anyone's game, but certainly that is one where China has the edge.
It's very interesting because, if you listen to this discussion from countries like Singapore, Malaysia, even to an extent to Japan, what I hear increasingly from people is, why would we want to spend millions and millions of dollars trying to develop a foundational model when we can be fast followers? When we can, just pick something up of DeepSeek and we can run with it. And we spoke yesterday with the Minister of Digital Development and Information here in Singapore, and she said, Singapore is sort of agnostic about that. We get that DeepSeek is stigmatized in the US as being Chinese and security risk and that the US government is telling agencies not to use it. But we are just objective about it. Does it work? Is it efficient? Is it cheap? What can we do with it? And I think you go around the region, for third-party countries, that has a lot of appeal. And so they're taking up the Chinese tools rather than the US tools. But I think your soft power point is a really interesting one. Riva, let's turn to you. Paul also raised this issue of hardware, as did Rui. You look at this a lot. What are you seeing in terms of the development in the Rivalry in areas like robotics, humanoid robots, drones, that sort of thing? How concerned should we be about that?
Well, two things. I think, as everyone here has said, right, that China is very focused on real-world AI deployment on the edge, and it can make great strides there. There's a ton of potential. On the hardware side, when we're looking at critical inputs, really we're talking about the GPUs, namely here, and that's really where the focus of what U.S. tech control policy has been. And we're in a very weird moment right now. And it's just a really interesting juncture this week itself, given what everyone has now seen as the H-20 ban reversal by the Trump administration, which was a restriction placed by this administration itself in early April, and which is now being claimed as a bargaining chip with China. But
so say a little bit more about this for people that might not know what those H-20 chips are. This is an NVIDIA chip that was developed specifically for China. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
It was developed as a response to U.S. controls in the Biden era, right? So as NVIDIA was seeing tightening controls on these, the compute parameters of what it could develop, it basically downgraded this chip so that it could be compliant with U.S. export controls and could continue selling into the China market. And NVIDIA repeatedly says, look, this is a chip that's not good for training, right? This is optimized for inference. And so that's part of its argumentation to the administration to say, look, you don't need to worry about this chip in terms of, end use concerns and military concerns, which is a really interesting argument here, right? Because as everyone here is talking about, there's so much that can be done in inference scaling, right? And all these real world AI applications to include, a ton of consumer applications, but a lot of things that are inherently dual use too. So it kind of raises a question of, are we going to see just sort of if the argument for the moment right now is that don't worry so much about inference scaling, you don't need to expand the controls to cover chips like the H-20, is the U.S. going to have a reflexive action once it starts to see China making really big strides in humanoid robots and all the different areas that we're talking about? I think so. I think we'll get to that kind of freak out moment that the U.S. is known for, but like I said, we're just in a weird transactional moment for the time being, and that's really centered on the H-20 and this departure, partly from this the Biden era paradigm shift on chip controls, which was really focused on increasingly restrictive measures, freeze-in-place measures to try to throttle Chinese chip production. And also cut off access to the most advanced AI chips. But now it seems like NVIDIA has really sold the argument to key members of the administration that really you need to go to a sliding scale approach, right? So this idea that if the product, a competitive product is available in the target market, that means you need to dynamically ease your controls, right? To allow access, allow American tech to compete head to head with the Chinese tech, with the assumption that the American tech will win out in the end. And that is what's going to inherently widen the U.S. lead. That's loaded with assumption as well, but that's where we are now.
So Jensen Huang went personally to the White House and really tried to make this argument that what we need to be doing is stoking Chinese addiction to the U.S. tech stack, and that's the smarter policy. Paul, I want to come to you. Do you think that argument alone persuaded the Trump administration to say, oh, okay, you're right, gosh, we changed our mind, we'll give them the H-20s? Or was there, Riva made this point about more of a kind of transactional mindset. Do you think that there were other factors involved in that decision?
Yeah, I definitely don't adhere to that view. I think there were a couple things happening. One was of course, the rare earth issue. And so
Yes.
there was a feeling that the Chinese came into London, for example, with pretty aggressive demands around export controls. And so I think what happened is, as part of this so-called mosaic agreement that Secretary Bessent alluded to, that the H-20s were sort of thrown into the mix here. And again, the other important thing is that when Jensen went to the White House in Mar-a-Lago, one of the key meetings he had was with David Sachs, the U.S. Crypto and AI czar, if you will, at the White House. And Sachs's views align more or less with Jensen's around this idea that allowing these things like H20 to go, which people have called fourth tier and deprecated GPUs, that needs to happen to keep some dependence on the US AI stack in China. Now, the complicating issue around that is, as Riva has noted, now what does that mean going forward for this? Because the Chinese companies that love the H20 for inference, how long will they love it? And technology is changing rapidly, and you have to have a path to upgrade your hardware, or the addiction, if, as it were, is not viable. So, what new drugs will the Commerce Department allow Chinese companies to have access to? That's really the big question going forward here. Because yes, I agree with Riva. It's a big deal that they roll back this whole control on the H20, which was very much championed by some in the Trump administration and others, even in the Biden era, who thought that as inference is becoming more important, that the control should extend not just focus on advanced training GPUs, but also on inference. So we're sort of in a very weird moment where we don't really know where the U.S.-China relationship is going. We obviously both sides seem to want to trade an economic deal, and we'll probably have a leaders meeting in November and negotiations next week in Stockholm after the Geneva and London talks. But where the tech controls are going is unclear. There's no real leadership on this issue at the White House now, as there was in the Biden era. No clear sort of set of people that were driving this idea of controlling compute governance, right, to throttle China's government's abilities to develop advanced models. So we're in a little bit of a weird moment here. But I think the H20s and Jensen's sort of arrival emergence as a diplomat here, and at least for the moment, being able to convince the Trump people that this was a good idea, is really an important moment. But going forward, there are a lot of issues still around how this will evolve.
Jensen's role is very fascinating to me right now, because he's just kind of emerged. Everyone was saying that Elon was the business ambassador from the U.S. to China. Elon now has gone from being in the White House to sort of being in the doghouse, and no longer playing that role. Jensen goes from the White House and Mar-a-Lago immediately to China, and celebrates the release of some of these restrictions. But Ray, I want to ask you, this argument that he makes about, it's good to get China addicted to U.S. technology, that doesn't strike me as the kind of argument that would be very persuasive to people inside China. The idea of getting addicted to Western things is one of these kind of fundamental things that the Chinese don't like, and with good reason. How persuasive do you think that is, and do they sort of see through that, and how is China looking at this kind of shifting sort of ad hoc almost policy from the U.S. that Paul's describing?
I think there's the short-term view and the long-term view, right? The short-term view is that this is the best technology, this is the most robust ecosystem. If you're a builder and you're not trying to be some long-term ecosystem strategist, you build on NVIDIA. However, I think that of course, policymakers and anyone who has a longer time horizon that they're worried about, meaning, by the way, larger corporations, not just startups starve for speed, but larger corporations with bigger goals, right, multi-decade plans, they absolutely are for sure looking at domestic alternatives that are not subject to the whims of any U.S. administration. So, not to mention, right? It's not just that. It's not just about being dependent on foreign technology. It's that it's a great business, right? The $4 trillion company in the world right now is a chip company.
Right.
Yeah. Wouldn't you want to have one of your own?
Right. Right. Riva, One of the reasons this week is an interesting moment is that the Trump administration, I think tomorrow, is saying that it's going to release what they call their AI action policy or framework. And this is something that's been percolating since Trump came into the White House. It's a reset of AI policy from the Biden administration's policy. What are you, I mean, that's going to happen presumably overnight, our time here in Singapore. Obviously, you must be following this very closely. What do you expect the White House to announce? I mean, Trump is going to unveil this personally, I guess, right?
Yeah, a press conference apparently sponsored by the All In Pod with David Sachs. So there you go. So yeah, it's all connected, right?
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, so this is David Sachs' podcast, and he became the White House kind of AI and technology czar in a way, and now he's introducing this policy on his podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they're going to be heavily emphasizing the promote side of this, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of the deregulation agenda to really fuel these AI infrastructure build-outs in the United States. So you're seeing EOs that are attached to that. There's also this, notion of kind of reversing Biden era woke AI, so to speak, and making, kind of a political statement around that, and some related measures. And the energy point here is huge, right? In the U.S.-China competition, this is where China has a massive advantage. And, EOs are one thing, executive orders, but anybody who's in this business knows very well that it's very difficult to actually get these projects off the ground. Seeing hyperscalers and all kinds of players just throwing money at this, that just as diverse an energy set as possible to reach these moonshot goals. But this is going to be tough, right? And actually getting things off the ground and actually assessing what's the right energy mix. So a lot of work is being done now to figure out just where the fastest build out's going to take place in the world, just given energy capacity requirements, right? What does that mean for energy diplomacy moving forward as well? As that's going to be an interesting question. So anyway, I think that's going to be a big emphasis. I don't expect much in terms of the restrict side, partly because there's just still a lot of contradiction, right? Everything we've been talking about on what this H20 reversal represents. When I talk about that sliding scale approach, you have a number of semiconductor manufacturing equipment players that would love to ride that wave and say, yeah, us too, right? Like AMEC, NORA, and China, when these are Chinese SME players that are making advancements too. So you shouldn't restrict us either. We should be allowed, the ability to compete. But I think there's going to be a massive exception there, right? Where the U.S. intent is still to constrain Chinese chip production. And even from NVIDIA's perspective, they don't want anything that's going to enable Huawei, and SMIC's production capacity even further. So like I said, there's a lot of, ifs and buts that come with this tech policy, and for the personalities involved, it's just not a very straightforward, here's the doctrine and everything that's entailed in it. I wouldn't expect anything like that.
We just got a couple of minutes here, but Riva, that point that you raise about the energy part of this is really crucial, and I'd love to hear, if we can, maybe from Paul and Helen about this. China and the U.S. have a completely different philosophy about how to support the energy that will be necessary to power AI. The U.S. is taking a very carbon-intensive drill baby drill approach, wants to do it with fossil fuels. China going absolutely in the opposite direction. Paul, how much does that matter in terms of the long-run competitiveness of these two AI models?
I think it's not as important as people think, right? Because energy is a local issue, and I think in terms of the sort of broader AI rivalry, it's really the action is going to be in terms of the model development uptake and elsewhere. The OSTP action plan that Riva mentioned and other U.S. initiatives, I think are going to address the energy issue, but that's a long-term problem for the U.S. And China definitely has an advantage because of it's a major. It's taken major steps to electrification and having a unified grid. So certainly powering AI infrastructure in China is not going to be that big of an issue, and probably end up providing some, price and cost advantage.
Did we lose Paul? He froze there for a moment. I'm going to come to Helen, give you the last word. We've got just a few seconds. What do you think are going to be the big surprises in the US-China AI relationship in the next, say, 6 months?
I think the biggest question is just how much value do the big US companies get out of these gigantic new supercomputers that they have built? They've spent years planning to build the next generation of larger, more compute-intensive data centers that they can train bigger models on and run bigger models on. We just saw, what it was a week ago, both OpenAI and Google DeepMind announcing that they had won gold on the International Math Olympiad, a very complicated, very advanced math accomplishment for these models, and I understand that was using large amounts of compute. So these companies are betting that the fact that they do have access to more and better chips, which they really do, even if China still has some access to some good chips, the companies are betting that, the US companies are betting that having that much larger volume is going to be a strategic advantage. And that is really an open question. A lot of people in the industry think it is. A lot of people in the industry think it won't be a big advantage. So it's really to be seen.
Great. Thank you all. Paul, Helen, Ray, Riva, just a spectacular kind of murderer's row of great policy experts. Really appreciate you taking the time to join with Fortune, and we hope to see you at other Fortune events in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Clay.
Thanks, Mike.
That was great. I hope you enjoyed that.